Good to see you, Sophia. How's Beijing?
Well, Beijing is great. My background is that what reminds you? I took my kids to the Forbidden City, and it's always nice. And I like this angle in particular. It's outside. It's outside
Yeah,
the Forbidden City, but I just like that angle because
yeah.
it looks like outside and inside the wall. You know, you see something there, kind of mysterious. And then the river is to protect the Forbidden City.
Mhm.
So the whole thing is kind of
Course.
interesting. Um,
The Gugong, isn't it? The old palace, isn't that
yes,
what most
Google,
people
yes.
call it?
Yeah,
Yes,
the old
the
palace, yes.
Gugong. Yeah.
And I also took my kids to Hunan province, you know, where Mao Zedong is from. I actually visited his hometown, you know, his houses and all
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
The tour guide told us that there are more people now interested in visiting that place because they want to learn more about
Mhm.
him. I just want to check with you. I know that in the West, they portray him, Mao, as this horrible dictator, which is very different from how he's perceived in China. People, the more, you know, China developed, the more people are saying, you know, China wouldn't be today's China without him, which is true. Now, he's not
Yeah.
perfect like anybody, you know, nobody's perfect.
Mhm.
He made mistakes, you know, the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, those were mistakes. I don't want to, you know, minimize those mistakes, but it is true that China's today wouldn't be China's today without him. What is your view
Mhm.
on him? I'm just a little bit curious.
Absolutely. I remember him very well, of course. He died in 1976, so
Hmm.
I was 15. I thought he was an absolutely titanic figure,
Hmm.
and I think that he saved China.
Yeah.
And when I say saved China, I mean, if you look at what China went through, he was an absolutely heroic figure in resisting the Japanese.
Yes.
I think that is something that, again, in the West, people simply don't appreciate. But
Mhm.
the Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army, which he led, were the core to the resistance against the Japanese. Because, I mean, Chiang Kai shek was just so corrupt and so much under the control of the British, basically, that, I mean, he just wasn't resisting the Japanese. And he was much more interested, in fact, in fighting the Communist Party and the
Mhm.
People's
Mhm.
Liberation Army than he was in fighting the Japanese. So he played an absolutely fundamental role in all of this.
Yeah.
Then he brought unity and stability to China and to its people, such as they simply had not had for 100 and more years, and he gave them their pride back. So, I
Mhm.
mean, he created the governmental system that exists to this day in China. I mean, the whole structure. He gave the unity to the country. But this is a thing that perhaps people don't remember as well in China itself. I mean, the sheer sense of pride finally the Chinese people had again in China, the sense that China was once again coming together, becoming a country
Mhm.
and becoming a strong country again. And he also played an absolutely critical role, a crucial role in the whole process of decolonization around the world, which simply cannot be underestimated. I mean, I remember he was a titanic figure. And I remember when the Americans met him in the early 70s. And he was an old man and clearly past his prime, but they were in absolute awe of him. One
Mhm.
of the earliest memories I have, by the way, of politics was going to a cinema in Athens in the 60s. Must have been 1966, and seeing film of him, in that extraordinary swim on the
Mhm.
Yangtze
Uh-huh.
River, which, or was it the Yellow River? I can't remember what it was, but it was
Young, yeah,
which,
young the river.
um,
Yeah.
again, people in the West don't talk about anymore. But I mean, it was one of the great iconic events of the 1960s. And
Mhm.
yes, obviously, the Cultural Revolution went completely out of control.
Mhm.
The Great Leap Forward, I personally suspect that when we get to unscramble all the stories, we will find that actually more progress was achieved during that period than, I
Probably.
mean,
Mhm.
I'm in terrible suffering as well.
Mhm.
But again, um, what people tend to overlook once more is that the period from 1950 to 57 was a period of very, very rapid economic and industrial growth in China. Growth was running at about 7% per annum. So, I mean, people were immediately seeing a major change in their lives. And then again, after the Great Leap Forward, and after the Cultural Revolution, growth resumed. So, I mean, he was, as I said, an epochal figure. No, I absolutely take that view. I can completely understand why the Chinese people think so highly of him, and I would, frankly, if I was Chinese.
Yeah.
Can I just say something? I mean, if you go to Russia today, there is a massive reassessment underway in Russia of Joseph Stalin.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a very, very widespread view today in Russia that, he was actually, again, for all his faults, ultimately a titanic leader
Mm-hmm.
who again led Russia, the Soviet Union, through victory in the Second World War against the Germans,
Mm-hmm.
and who achieved the industrialization of the country, and who again saved Russia from complete annihilation. So I mean, there is a swing back to Stalin as well, and I don't know whether you know, but the city that used to be Stalingrad and then
Mm-hmm.
became Volgograd apparently wants to go back and start calling itself Stalingrad again. And you may also be interested to know that in Russia, and I saw it while I was there actually in St. Petersburg, there was a formerly famous poster of Stalin and Mao together.
Oh, okay.
Because Mao
Yeah.
came
Uh-huh.
came to came to the Soviet Union and met Stalin in,
Mm-hmm.
I think it was 1949. But anyway, there's a picture of the two of them together. It's not a photograph.
Mm-hmm.
It's a poster.
Uh-huh. Interesting.
So
Well,
so
in Hunan
yeah
province, in the Hunan province in particular, I think he's almost like Mao is almost like a godlike figure. And what's interesting to
yeah
me, the tour guide actually told us that when you visit his birthplace, there's a statue and all that sort of thing. He said actually you're not
mm,
allowed to kneel down. You're allowed to bow down and then bring flowers. They don't want
yeah
to godify him. He is human. He
no
made mistakes. So they actually recognize that. So I actually think that's a good thing. That's a
yeah
sensible thing. Don't make him like a
absolutely no of
figure.
course it is
Yeah. So I think that's
absolutely which is right, and it's not the Chinese thing anyway. Actually, I mean, it's never been. The Chinese people have never been into declaring their leaders gods. We do that
yeah.
in the West, not in China. The ancient Greeks did it too, by the way. They made their leaders divine, as did the emperors,
Yeah.
the Roman emperors. So,
And the other thing is just over the weekend, I don't know if you pay attention to the Dragon Boat Festival, which is, uh, yeah, Dragon Boat Festival is interesting. I think you can probably share it with your wife, Catherine. She might find it interesting because Dragon Boat Festival is celebrating a person called Qu Yuan. He's most famous being a poet, but he's also a statesman. He's very important during the warrior period. His country at the time is the one of those seven countries that was fighting the Qin dynasty, the Qin, and then Qin, of course, his country is Chu, and Chu was defeated. So he killed himself. He jumped into the river and then killed himself for that. And then the people was very sad that he was a good statesman, a prime minister kind of person.
right,
So they wrapped the 粽子, but basically put food into wrappers and throw into the river so that the fish will eat those food instead of eating him. So that's what the Dragon Boat Festival, the Dragon Boat Festival come from. So it's a festival in memory
interesting.
of this person, even though he was a great statesman, but mainly people remember him as a great poet, a great writer, that kind of personality. You might find that
Interesting. Yeah.
interesting. So.
That's very interesting. It's very Chinese again. I mean, the China has these extraordinary cultural figures who
Mhm.
are so important to the Chinese people. There's no analog to this in the West, by
Uh-huh.
the way. I mean,
Yeah.
there is no. If anything, the one that is closest is Pushkin to the Russians,
Okay.
but
Pushkin.
China
Yeah.
has many, many more people like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but China's many, many more people like that.
Yeah.
That these tremendous cultural personalities that are seen as not just statesmen, but as builders
Uh-huh.
of
Yeah.
Chinese civilization,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is something that Chinese people take so seriously, and
Yeah.
are rightly so, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Um, let's start with the South Korea election, right? Which just happened. So Lee Jae-ming, he won. He's regarded as pro-China. I'm not sure that's the reason he was elected. What is your take?
Well, I think in a kind of a way it probably is actually. South Korea is a regime that was associated with the previous leader, the one who's gone, who carried
Uh-huh.
out the attempted coup
Uh-huh.
and all that, which was very, very pro-American, created massive problems with the North Korea,
Mhm.
which was straightforwardly anti-Chinese as well, in the sense that he was aligning South Korea with the United States and Japan in an alliance against China,
Mhm.
because ultimately, as I said, everything comes down to China,
Mhm.
and who was also supplying shells and weapons to Ukraine to
Yeah.
fight Russia,
Mhm.
something which upset the Russians, who had
Mhm.
up to that time fairly good relations with South Korea. So I think this does represent a major sea change. So I think I went to South Korea in the early 2000s. I think it was 2002. And I was struck how even then the influence of China was very strong. I mean, the cultural influence of China, it was everywhere. So I cannot even begin to imagine how it is today. It must be something that is absolutely pervasive in South Korea. So what we had was an attempt to pull South Korea away from its natural course and alignment. And I think this election reflects this. And the deeper political crisis we have seen in South Korea probably reflects it as well, in that we had an attempt by a pro-American government to prize South Korea away from its natural alignments.
Now, in the meantime, also in Asia, the Shangri-La Dialogue, which had a lot of got lots of attention in China. Now, China didn't send its foreign minister this time. Normally, it would, but this time China didn't. China has been unhappy about the Shangri-La Dialogue for a while because this is supposed to be a forum for Asian countries to talk about defense, to communicate. But of course, every time the United States will come, and this time
Yeah.
Macron even went there and give this speech and threatening China, saying if you don't control North Korea, NATO will come and stuff like that. What is your take on that? People are not very happy
Well,
about the speech.
well, I can imagine. I mean, is this the same Macron who met with Xi Jinping? Was it a year ago, or just before that, and was coming back to Europe and saying what a wonderful thing it would be to have a good relationship with China, and who received Xi Jinping with massive honors and in Paris, and brought out the horse guards for him, which I could see the Chinese weren't impressed by at all, by the way. But anyway, that was it. So this is Macron, and he swings around like a weather vane. But ultimately, now he's completely given up his heart and soul to the Americans, or a faction within the US. The Americans, as you rightly say, have basically gate crashed this dialogue. Macron has invited himself, so he gate crashed it too. We've had incredibly belligerent speeches now, not just from Macron,
Mhm.
but from Pete Hegseth.
Mhm.
So I think, from every conceivable point of view, it makes absolute sense for the Chinese to stay away. Why would they go to be lectured?
And also, meantime, not just the verbal, like heated verbal exchange, not exchange, but verbal threat or something. But also, there has been a military exercise the U.S. conduct shortly before the Shangri-La Dialogue, which in China being interpreted as a threat, like before we say something, let's do some exercise. And the U.S. did that with the Philippines, Japan, and South Korea. And even the USS Nimitz aircraft carrier was supposed to head to Middle East, but then turned back I guess, to participate in this military exercise in the South China Sea. And in the midst of all that, I think last weekend there was a rumor. I don't see report in the West, but there is a rumor circling, heavily circling in China, that China shot down a F-35. So the whole thing is
Oh,
kind of, yeah,
no,
the whole
no,
thing
it
is
has
kind of,
not been reported in the
no, no,
West.
at all. So
Mm,
here's what
mm.
happened. The Chinese government social media account posted like a 10 seconds recording of a pilot reporting to the central command saying object disappeared from radar, should have been eliminated. Something like that, a very short sentence, like
Well,
a 10 seconds. And then without any explanation, but this is a very reputable government official account. So people started trying to interpret what it means. Now, the most people believe that means one F-35, which is stealth jet plane, was shut down. Okay, so that's the speculation. The interesting thing about that is with so much speculation, the Chinese government never came out saying, no, 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 that's not true. So which is being interpreted as probably that's what happened. What I'm trying to say is that it seems like the situation probably is more tense, more, more than what we see on the surface. It's not just a verbal attack. What do you think?
absolutely, absolutely. Can I just say quickly about this? I mean, it has not been reported in the West
Mhm.
for very, very obvious reasons, especially if it was an F-35. That would be very, very, very alarming because we've been told repeatedly that these are, invisible and
Mhm.
the best fighter jets in the world. They're not, by the way, but anyway, that's the story. But I do know an awful lot about incidents like this during the Cold War, and it turns out that there were many, many attempts by the Americans throughout the Cold War to intrude into Soviet airspace. And
Uh-huh.
quite a lot of American fighter jets and aircraft were shot down by the Soviets during the Cold War. And these incidents were never reported
Mhm.
because both sides wanted to avoid a pattern of escalation arising out of them. But certainly this happened several times, and it would not at all surprise me if it happened again. I mean, I'm not sure where this incident took place, but clearly it was close to Chinese
Mhm.
territory,
Mhm.
and by territory one includes, of course, seas adjoining China. So it's entirely, it would not surprise me in any way at all if something like this were to happen. And of course, if it was happening, the Americans were intruding again into Chinese territory and behaving in an incredibly aggressive way,
Mhm.
like they always do, actually.
Mhm. Mhm.
And what exactly they're doing, testing China, trying to work out what the strength of what China's defenses are. Who knows?
Mhm.
But I mean, they do this, and as I said, it's very, very dangerous.
I feel like the United States probably is frustrated right now because uh, my understanding is that Pete Hegseth went to Shangri-La expecting to meet the Chinese defense minister, Dong Jun.
Yeah.
But after he left the United States, that's when the Chinese announced that Dong Jun is not coming. Instead, they sent a university, a military university, to study, to observe the meeting rather than actively participating. And so he was very frustrated, I
Yes.
guess. And then also, I guess there's a lot of other things we can talk later about trade that frustrating the U.S. So the U.S. goes with what it can, which is trying to show the muscle, kind of bullying through all kinds of means, verbally and exercise militarily. Is that what shows the U.S.
Yeah.
frustration?
Yes, it is, and it's a repeat of what happened during the Biden era. If you remember, there was a
Uh,
whole period of lasted about a year when China was not meeting U.S. officials, and the Americans began to become increasingly worried and anxious and angry about this. And eventually, I think it was Jake Sullivan managed to sort of go to China and
mm,
eventually broke the ice. But I think it's the same. I think that China has basically had enough,
mm,
and as they've had tariff wars, they've had threats. They're having more threats now, by the way, on the trade issue, which we will come to, as you said.
mm,
And I think that the Chinese are saying, look, this is hopeless. There's no sense in meeting and sitting down and talking with these people when they are being so incredibly aggressive and rude to us. If we sit down and talk to them when they're in this kind of mood, we're going back to the thing where they talk to us when they want to and are rude to us when they also want to. They lecture us and they don't listen, and they do the opposite of what they say. So there's no point in conducting a dialogue when the Americans are in this kind of mood. And I think this is what we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah.